Good to go.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to make sure everyone's in the right session. You're here to learn about the BEAD program and our initial proposal, Volume 1 input session. Today is June 12th, and so welcome, and we're excited to be with you this afternoon. Chandler, first slide. So just to give you a little update on body, since 2017, Virginia has allocated $935 million in state and federal funding to extend broadband to over 380,000, locations in 80 cities and counties, with 5 new localities actually coming on board with the most recent announcement for the 2023 projects. You may all know by now, there's $42.5 billion allocated at the federal level through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act for the Broadband Equity, Access, and Adoption Program. And so there are many things that go along with receiving this funding, including planning funds. And so on June 30th, we will find out what the Commonwealth's allocation will be from the federal government. And so it is our belief that through both the investments we've made through body and the continued investments made by Governor Youngkin and the General Assembly and body, that Virginia will be positioned to be the first large state nationally to obligate funds to provide broadband access to all unserved locations. If the funding remains beyond this effort, and the team will talk about this a little bit this afternoon, priorities under broadband affordability and adoption can be explored. And so there's many steps that have to be done to be approved for the funding. Next slide. Is that my last slide, Chandler? All right, so that's enough for me talking. And so I'll go ahead and turn it over to Chandler and Cole, and they will get into the details of the BEAD program. Thank you.
Thanks, Tamara. I think I'm going to take it over from here, and I'm just going to go over some of the high-level overview of the BEAD program, and then I'm going to get into some of the details of the program and guiding principles going ahead, some of the priorities and federal requirements in the BEAD program, and then hand it back to Chandler to discuss the actual initial proposal. So Tamara went over most of these, so I won't go over it ad nauseum, but $42 billion federal program, the intent of which is to allow states to finish or make significant gains on extending broadband infrastructure. For Virginia, it's a great opportunity, as Tamara said, to finish deploying broadband infrastructure, achieve universal broadband connections, and then to start to explore potential non-deployment programs, affordability, adoption, broadly digital opportunity programs, as we refer to them. We can go to the next slide. So to date, we've already started our stakeholder engagement under the BEAD program. We've connected with local governments, tribal governments, internet service providers, nonprofits, community organizations across 4 listening sessions where we collected feedback from those groups. Now, this is another part of that effort under the initial proposal to collect input as we move forward with the program. Feedback from these listening sessions informed the development of this initial proposal. So we heard from local governments, tribal governments, ISPs, community organizations, incorporated that feedback into the 5-year plan, which is another document that I'll get into in the initial proposal. And we also are continuing to work with NTIA, which is the federal agency that is going to administer or is currently administering the BEAD program. We've worked with them on the initial proposal and will continue to throughout the process. So, broad overview, these are the stages of the BEAD program from a programmatic or document standpoint. The 5-year plan is similar to the Commonwealth Connect plan that you might be familiar with. So this is a document that the intent is to look across the next 5 years of broadband in the Commonwealth, discuss the BEAD program, other programs that the Broadband Office is running, tie it all together, align those programs, and basically explain how Virginia plans to achieve universal coverage, and then also, if you could mute yourself, mute. Sorry about that. So that's the 5-year plan. The initial proposal, what we're talking about today, is the nuts and bolts policy document that actually explains how the Broadband Office plans to award the funds from the BEAD program and then manage the funds once awarded. The final proposal is the document that is sort of a follow-up to the initial proposal that explains how remaining funds are going to be used. And then that final proposal will also start to address non-deployment programs, as the NTIA calls them, affordability programs that push adoption of broadband, anything under the non-deployment categories. We can go to the next slide. So this is a list of the mandated priorities that BEAD funding is supposed to be spent according to how the NTIA has prioritized the funds. Asterisk for this for Virginia, we're lucky enough, or not lucky enough, but through the hard work of the Broadband Office and the VODI program and everybody here on this call, we can start to consider these priorities in combination with each other through applications for unserved, underserved, community anchor institutions all at the same time. Because the VODI program has done so much work in Virginia, we don't necessarily have to go one by one, but I'll go through them just because they are important. First is to reach unserved areas. So meaning you need to use BEAD funding to reach every unserved location before you can start to consider underserved. Again, that doesn't necessarily apply for Virginia. Unserved is 25 over 3 speeds. Then underserved, those lacking 100 over 20. Third, workforce development. And you can see here why it's important that they can be done simultaneously, because you want to support workforce development as you're extending this infrastructure and making awards. Connecting community anchor institutions that can be connected to, if they don't have community anchor institution as it will be defined, if they're not connected to gigabit symmetrical service, then we can do that under the BEAD program. Start to support broadband adoption programs. And then finally, and this is one that we will observe in terms of the how the funding is prioritized. The non-deployment programs can be addressed once you have allocated funds to connect all unserved, underserved community anchor institutions. That's when you can start to explore funding non-deployment programs with BEAD funds. So the top 4 are sort of simultaneous, and then you can look towards the 5th non-deployment program. And then last thing here, I'm just going to discuss some of the guiding principles that our office has as we move into the BEAD program. First, finish the deployment job in Virginia, obligate funds to remaining unserved, underserved locations that don't have a funded project to extend service to that location. Second, take as many of the elements of the VODI program that have made VODI such a successful program, and incorporate those into BEAD where possible. Maintain the momentum from the VODI program through the BEAD program by accelerating the 5-year plan and the initial proposal, any other documents that are required by NTIA or plans, moving as quickly as possible. And then finally, conducting robust stakeholder input that started with those listening sessions that I went over, and then we'll continue through the initial proposal and the final proposal and throughout the BEAD program. So I'm going to hand it off to Chandler to go into some of the more specific. I'm going to mute. I'll leave it, Chandler.
Yeah, thanks, Cole. I appreciate that. So Cole did a lot of context building on what the BEAD program is. Now we'll get into what we're looking for input on, the challenge process. So I'll go through the key components, provide a quick overview of what the challenge process or in all of initial proposal volume 1 under the BEAD program entails. Just want to start off from a very basic and introductory perspective. The way we think about BEAD from the state broadband office is that the BEAD program and the initial proposal and the notice of funding opportunity, NTIA's guidelines for the program, we interpret them to be for a state that is getting their broadband office up off the ground. And there are a great set of guidelines for that. The stakeholder community in Virginia, thanks to the good work by the General Assembly governor establishing VODI and folks carrying it forward now through 6 funding cycles, is we've gotten used to a certain process in the state through the VODI guidelines and criteria. There are a lot of things in the BEAD Notice of Funding Opportunity, which we'll talk about in a minute, that are prescribed down to us as a state broadband office. We're not going to say that that they're bad, but they will take some getting used to, right? So that's what we're here to talk through today, to explain what the BEAD challenge process entails, along with the other initial proposal Volume 1 components, and then work together to make sure that we're all on the same page about how to submit challenges, how to determine the realm of unserved locations under BEAD, which set us up well for the remaining components to get to universal connectivity in the Commonwealth. So wanted to provide that opening disclaimer for folks out there, just so we're all on the same page about how we think about the BEAD program and how these guidelines will be rolled out for broadband deployment in the Commonwealth. So Volume 1 of the initial proposal has 4 separate components, and I'm going to talk through each one on independent slides later, but you can see them up here. An inventory of existing funding opportunities, classifying all unserved and underserved locations in the Commonwealth, identifying community anchor institutions, and then the BEAD challenge process, lastly, and what I would consider the most important section that all these other criteria then feed into for the challenge process. I'm not going to read through this slide, but this is the specific language in the Notice of Funding Opportunity, which we can think of as the BEAD guidelines document for state broadband offices. This is the specific language out of the Notice of Funding Opportunity NOFO for Volume 1 initial proposal components. Folks can read that at their own leisure. It's also included in our public comment document that's out there now for review. We want to talk through what's in Volume 1, what's coming in Volume 2, and I'll talk on the next slide about why we're looking at these 2 volumes, because I think sometimes that's a point of confusion. Well, if there's Volume 1, how many volumes are there, and when's the next one going to come out? Volume 2, it's important to see what the components of Volume 2 are when we're commenting on Volume 1 of the initial proposal. So Volume 2 is a heavier document, literally and figuratively, where we'll have long-term objectives in Volume 2, how we're going to engage broadband providers, nonprofits, local governments in the process, how we're going to do initiatives to aid deployment efforts. So as a state broadband office, can we assist by assisting any workforce development efforts across the Commonwealth to aid broadband deployment? We're also going to have to consider some things in there that are federal requirements that are passed down to state broadband offices to consider. So 2 examples of that are strong labor practices and assessing climate threats in terms of how can we smartly deploy broadband networks to make sure they're resilient to climate threats in 2 years or 2 decades. But then I think what folks will be most interested in are those programmatic components of the BEAD program. And we've talked these up a little bit in our listening sessions that Cole mentioned earlier, but it's things like, how much will we pay as a broadband office for one location to be connected to fiber, which is the preference under the BEAD program, not the state preference, but what the BEAD program establishes as the priority solution for the unserved. What the evaluation criteria of proposals, as well as the level of geography that will accept proposals from broadband providers under BEAD. You guys can find a comprehensive list of this, and this is the italicized text at the bottom, pages 30 to 32 on the Notice of Funding Opportunity. Pretty easily accessible through a Google search. If you need the direct link to the NOFO, let us know, we'll email it over. 2 volumes of the initial proposal. This is explained, I've got to talk through this in terms of an order of operation. It was a process that was set up by NTIA, the administrators of the BEAD program, to allow states that want to keep moving quickly under the BEAD program, to keep momentum up in their own states, to move faster than a state that might want to wait until they've had a chance to invest their American Rescue Plan dollars or Capital Project Fund dollars, which, yes, are still happening in some states, things that we did back in December of 2021. And Cole just put a link to the Notice of Funding Opportunity in the chat. But submitting in 2 volumes allows us to move quicker, bottom line. Thinking through this process-wise, the way I think NTIA has thought about it, this is me speaking for them, so I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but in terms of thinking about the 2 processes, a state can identify the universe of unserved and underserved locations in a state separate of setting its own program guidelines and criteria about how to reach those locations. Those 2 processes don't have to be considered in tandem of each other, and that's why we've split it out into Volume 1 and Volume 2. The way we move faster is that by submitting Volume 1, that'll be considered by NTIA. Once that is approved, and we have submitted, only submitted, not approved, Volume 2 for consideration by NTIA, then we can move on with the challenge process while volume 2 is actively being considered by the federal government. I'm struggling with a little bit about how to put an exact timeline about how many months that moves us quicker through this process. But a few weeks, at least, in terms of allowing us to have volume 1 approved, volume 2 submitted and being under consideration. That gets broadband deployed faster in the Commonwealth. It helps us stay ahead of supply chain and workforce constraints that we see out there in the field, that will be further induced by this massive federal investment in broadband expansion. We're going to get through the 4 components of this initial proposal and taking a deep dive into each one of those. I'll breeze through the ones that are fairly simple, starting with the first one, an inventory of existing funding solutions. This is programs that have been conducted at the state level or federal level to deploy broadband infrastructure to unserved and underserved areas as defined in the BEAD program. For the folks that want a lot of reading, go see footnote 52 in the Notice of Funding Opportunity. I don't know what page it's on, but that defines the list of programs that we have to consider in the BEAD program for funding deployment efforts in terms of an inventory of state and federal efforts out there. You can see the ones we've identified up here on the screen. They're also listed in that draft volume 1 initial proposal. I'd like to spend a little more time on this slide. This is both requirement 2 and requirement 3 together in tandem. Section 2 is identifying the universe of unserved and underserved locations in the Commonwealth, based on the Federal Communications Commission's broadband map that was published on May 30th. I want to unpack unserved and underserved really quick for the folks that may not be initiated on the call. At the state level, through the body program guidelines, we define all locations that lack access to broadband at 100 megabits download, 20 megabits upload as unserved. At the federal level, the definition is 2-tiered. Functionally, the outcome is still the same, but it's a 2-tiered definition at the federal level through the BEAD program. Unserved is those locations that lack 25 megabits download, 3 megabits upload. Underserved is those locations that lack 100 megabits down, 20 megabits up. Functionally, it's the same thing, but you'll hear us talking about locations under the BEAD program and those 2-tiered setups, just because the way the guidance is put down from the federal government for us to use and implement as state broadband offices. This list that we published of unserved and underserved locations, we are proposing in our guidance to be solely based on the Federal Communications Commission's broadband map. We know that there's about 443,000 locations that fall into those 2 different categories based on the FCC map that came out on May 30th. And I'm going to talk through why we need to take into account funding programs here in a little bit. Section 3 is something new to us, and this also deserves some explanation. Under the BEAD program, like Cole mentioned, one of the opportunities is to make sure that community anchor institutions have access to gigabit symmetrical service at their locations. In order to identify the realm of community anchor institutions out there, state broadband offices under BEAD can do 2 things. They can set a definition for what a community anchor institution is, and then they conduct a challenge process to classify community anchor institutions that fall into that definition. So the definition of a community anchor institution here is extremely important, which then community anchor institutions, nonprofits, schools, libraries, healthcare providers, public safety entities can then come in and classify themselves under to raise their hand and say, hey, I'm a community anchor in the Commonwealth. I either want to be listed on your database, or if I'm unconnected or don't have access to a gigabit symmetrical service, they can raise their hand and say, hey, we should be an eligible location under BEAD and be eligible to receive funding. So I wanted to call that out and place emphasis about why this definition of community anchor institution matters, even more so than it did under the VADI state guidelines. We'll publish that list of community anchor institutions that's currently listed on the Commonwealth Connection map as a map layer folks can toggle through. But in full transparency, that list is a little dated, and we need everybody's help in updating that to make sure it's as accurate as possible to this proposed definition of what a community anchor institution is in the Commonwealth. So here's the meat, the main course of this volume 1 is the challenge process. And this is a disclaimer too to start. The guidance that has been incorporated into volume 1 of our initial proposal is the draft model that was put out by NTIA when they put their challenge process out for public comment. NTIA has not yet published their final challenge guidance. We believe it'll be very similar to the draft model they put out, but we don't believe it's going to be the exact same. So to keep momentum under the BEAD program, what we'll be doing as an office is considering comments to our volume 1 of the initial proposal in light of what NTIA publishes as their final challenge process guidance. Those comments will be carried forward and considered when we're putting the draft model of their challenge process into our guidelines, reflective of the comments that we receive on this draft model challenge process. The next key points there at the bottom is it's a substantially different process, and the challenge process under BEAD is substantially different than that of VADI for state general funds. Like I said on the last slide, the starting point, and this is the beginning of the major differences, is that as a broadband office, we publish the list of unserved and underserved locations for folks to go in and check. As you guys know, that's not the case under state general funds. For the VADI program, you guys come to us with applications. We put those application areas out for challenge. And the timeline and the phases are also different under this federal model, which we'll talk about on future slides. We've already hinted at a couple of these bullets on this slide about major differences between the two processes. I'll highlight the new ones. Challenges can be made under the BEAD challenge process in both directions. So under VADI, you guys are familiar with the process of posting application areas for reviews. Challenges to the VADI state guidelines, or challenges to VADI application areas for state general funds, are only in one direction. It's only a provider claiming that additional areas in that application area are actually already served and shouldn't be eligible for state investment for broadband expansion. Under the BEAD program, it works both ways. We publish a list of locations. Local governments, nonprofits, and broadband providers can say more locations are served, but they can also say more locations are in fact unserved than what we've published as a state broadband office. Challenges have to be submitted at the location level, but we're going to invite bulk submissions through an Excel spreadsheet style for folks to challenge multiple locations if they want to challenge more than one, which we assume is going to be the case. We're standing up a challenge portal with our folks at Virginia Tech, who've also worked with us on collecting service territory data from ISPs in the MAP process. And another key difference too is that the results and the information input into the challenge process will be made publicly available. The challenge information and the rebuttal information under this VADI state general fund process has never been concealed. We just haven't actively posted it onto our website. But under the BEAD program, as required by the transparency plan on the last page of the volume 1, we are slated to be posting the challenge, the rebuttal information, and then also what the outcome was for each individual challenge we receive under the BEAD program in either direction that it's made in. We're not going to include, the only caveat there is we're not including personally identifiable information. If somebody submits their bill from ISPA as justification of service, we're not going to share the bill with their name and address and last 4 digits of their credit card on there. And we've gotten a question from some folks and leading up to this, and you guys have heard us for years now share a lack of confidence at minimum in federal broadband availability maps. For the folks that are tuning into this conversation that may have not been around for a few months now, thankfully the federal government has updated their national broadband maps. And we believe through our work through the challenge process that those maps are now infinitely better than they were. You guys will remember that a federal broadband map used to display an entire census block as served if one location was claimed to be served by a broadband provider in that census block, which led to hundreds of thousands of potential homes having overstated coverage. The new federal broadband map is location-based. So at that link, which Cole, if you could paste that link to the national broadband map in the chat, that'd be helpful. Folks can go in and see service availability at the location level, including what broadband providers claim to provide service at that location. This has produced a more accurate national broadband map that we've helped make more accurate as a state broadband office. And we've worked with broadband providers to do this. And you guys have heard me talk about these numbers before. I'm not going to go through the first 2 because you've heard me talk and us talk ad nauseum about it. But the big takeaway is that through the challenge process, which our broadband office literally invested hundreds of hours into. We were able to help broadband providers and the FCC hone in on coverage. And between the two processes of the December map versus the May map, 80,000 more locations in the Commonwealth are now accurately displayed as unserved or underserved in that I'm sorry, just unserved. 80,000 additional unserved locations in the national broadband map than what was displayed back in the last map iteration in December. So I want to just take a moment to say thanks to the folks on the call that worked with us to refine that map and that process. The takeaway is that 80,000 more folks will now have broadband access under BEAD than what we previously would have gotten to. 80,000 locations, again, not individuals, 80,000 locations, which is a huge deal for us to make sure that we can be able to extend broadband infrastructure to everybody that lacks access, and nobody falls through the cracks in terms of a mapping classification. So I've only got a couple more slides left. There are 4 steps in this challenge process. This more closely mimics what we know as a state general funded process under VADI. There's the process of publishing application areas. Under the BEAD process, that's us publishing a list of unserved and underserved locations. Then there's 30 days to submit challenges, and I'm going to go over what challenges you guys can submit and the categories that are eligible to submit a challenge under on the next 2 slides. After those 30 calendar days after we've published and the challenge phase is complete, there'll be a rebuttal phase. The rebuttal phase, though, is conducted and proposed to be conducted on a rolling basis. So as we receive a challenge, that challenge would be made to a specific broadband provider at a specific location. We would then relay that challenge to the broadband provider to either provide rebuttal information or concede that challenge in that location is in fact unserved or served. After that, after we receive the information from both the challenger and the ISP rebutting that information, that's when the final determination is made by our office within 30 calendar days of receiving that rebuttal. And again, going back a couple of slides, all this information, according to the transparency plan and the volume 1 of the initial proposal, is publicly available. So on a rolling basis, we would be publishing locations we receive challenges on, the data that substantiates that challenge, rebuttals, data substantiating that rebuttal, and our final determination as a broadband office. I don't want to read through these extensive list of challenge criteria that are eligible criteria to submit, but I think it's important for everybody on the call to talk through this to know the realm of possibilities of submitting a challenge and what will be considered. This is something positive, and it's been good guidance that's come down from the federal level in their draft criteria for the challenge process. There are specific challenge categories that folks can submit challenges under. There are specifically outlined justifications for each one of those challenges and the required information to substantiate that challenge. And there's the same thing on rebuttals. Based on each challenge criteria, there's also specific requirements for the information that is required to be an effective rebuttal against that specific challenge. That list of criteria is in volume 1 of the initial proposal. We don't have the criteria required for the challenge and criteria required for the rebuttal in this PowerPoint presentation, but please go take a look at it. Tell us what you think, and so we can hone in on those criteria for this draft challenge process. So there, you'll see the criteria here on one specific challenge area of claiming locations are actually unserved or underserved when we as a broadband office have published that list and these locations are not in that list of unserved and underserved locations. You could say the broadband service is not offered at that location. You could say the fastest speed available at that location falls below what unserved or the underserved criteria is. You could challenge the location's broadband availability based on the latency, the maximum latency provided, and that exceeds 100 milliseconds. You could say that there's a data cap for consumers. That's unrealistic. You could say that the technology indicated is perhaps fiber, when in reality it's only DSL at that location. That's not the only example you can challenge based on, but it's an example of the technology indicated for that location being incorrect. You could say the location is residential, but the service available there is only available for businesses. Or you could also say, and this is the last challenge category, if we receive a challenge based on a federally awarded area, let's say it's under the ACAM auction, and I'm not familiar with the exact rules and guidelines of ACAM, but I'm just using it as an example. If you as a provider believe that the ACAM guidelines mean that that location is not under an enforceable commitment to 100% of the locations in that commitment, then you can submit a challenge saying that that ACAM area that we may have taken off the list of unserved and underserved locations in the Commonwealth should actually be put back on there. Glad to answer questions on that. I know that wasn't explained extremely clearly when we get to the discussion slide here in a couple of minutes. Going through these last two criteria here in a minute, two separate categories on this slide. What are the eligible challenges if you want to say a location is in fact served when we as a broadband office say it's either unserved or underserved in our list of locations? The first one is that the challenger, which in this case would be a broadband provider, would have knowledge that broadband will be deployed at the location by the date established in the deployment obligation. Piggybacking on that one, this is also another criteria here. The challenger has knowledge that broadband will be deployed at this location by June 30th, 2024, without an enforceable commitment, or a provider is building out broadband offering performance beyond the requirements of an enforceable commitment. That's a lot of language to boil down to and say that unlike the VADI State General Fund challenge process, which does not consider network built out after the application deadline, the BEAD challenge process does require states to consider network construction after the BEAD application deadline up until June 30th, 2024. Again, this is subject to public comment, but this is what's included in the model draft challenge process from NTIA. And the last criteria before we get into the discussion, challenge is about community anchor institutions. And this is getting back to us classifying a definition of community anchors. CAIs, the abbreviation of that, they can raise their hand in the challenge process and say, hey, we should be considered as a community anchor on your list based on your definition that you established as a state broadband office. In the other sense, they can, or a resident or somebody else can say that the location is not in fact a community anchor institution and it's just a house or it's a business or it's no longer operating. So before we get into the discussions and questions, I did miss a point back there, and this piggybacks on section 1 of the initial proposal and also section 4. We talked about the number in the universe of unserved locations in the Commonwealth being 443,000 and change per the May 30th National Broadband Map. That does not take into account where we have existing funding at work in the Commonwealth. We gave a presentation to the Broadband Advisory Council on Friday, and this is just for context. There's over 307,000 locations just in the last 2 out of 3 VADI award cycles out of the FY21 and FY22 award cycles. Locations that have existing funding under the VADI program or that suite of programs that we've identified under our Table 1 in the initial proposal Volume 1, as well as federal broadband deployment programs, which includes CAF and RDOF, are, by the definition and the guidelines set forth by NTIA for the BEAD program, are not eligible for BEAD investment. So when we publish a list of unserved and underserved locations as a broadband office, the existing areas for investment will be factored in. So we're publishing a list of unserved and underserved locations with the ones that have an existing funding agreement per the guidelines set forth by BEAD not in there. So you won't see 443,000 and change locations in our original documents. You'll see the list of locations with the ones taken out that are in an existing enforceable commitment for broadband access. Just wanted to make that clear before we move into the discussion component of this. Cole, Tamara, if you guys don't want to add anything else, or if I didn't miss anything in that long monologue of a presentation, we'll be glad to entertain questions from here. So if you're online, or if you want to put a question in the chat, It seems like these kind of things work best sometimes when we can put questions in writing in the chat. But if not, if you're unable to do that or on the phone, please unmute yourself. Bill, I see you've got your hand up, so go ahead and unmute yourself and ask a question.
I've actually got a couple questions, if you could bear with me.
Go for it.
The way I'm hearing this, are we, the local governments, going to be competing with ISPs for this money?
So, Bill, I'd encourage you to go back and go to the listening session recording as well here. I think you're on vacation recently, so that may be an unrealistic request. But the BEAD program, we are required to invite proposals directly from broadband providers. We want to include as much local coordination requirements as possible in this. So that would look like the Roanoke County Board endorsing or giving approval to either one or multiple broadband providers in that area. Those guidelines will come out in volume 2 of the initial proposal. But under the BEAD program, we're required as a broadband office to accept proposals directly from ISPs.
Well, and the bottom line is it all works out good if you get broadband to the addresses that don't have it. My next question is, other non-deployment uses, would that cover surveys to try and find unserved areas?
So we should talk more about what that survey entails and if it's for affordability efforts or adoption efforts or access efforts. And we're going to have a separate local government planning opportunity coming together for that under our planning grant funds that we should talk about more later. But for the BEAD challenge process, we are doing, and the state broadband offices are required to do the effort initially of classifying the unserved and underserved locations. So you guys as a county should submit a challenge to that based on what you know for broadband availability in your area.
Okay, and one last question, and then I'll let all the others fly in. And I think it's a great idea that you're modeling this after the VADI program, but how do you see this working funding wise? You know, because VADI, we did our money, your money, their money. And with this being federal money, do you see the program evolving?
So for the BEAD program, Bill, the BEAD program is set up for a large funding round of fiber to the home as preference under the BEAD program, and then subsequent rounds for locations that may have not been or may have not had a proposal received for them for a fiber to the home solution after that. Tamara, you've got your hand up, so do you want to chime in here?
Yes. So, Bill, I think your question is regarding the match requirement. And so BEAD has its own set of match requirements. It does require a 25% match that is predefined in the BEAD NOFO. As Chandler said, you guys might want to, I won't say it because Chandler's recording, but take a good evening and read the NOFO. It's really detailed. And so there is a 25% match requirement actually for the ISP. Whether a locality wants to put money on the table for a project to support an ISP is really up to a unit of local government. There is also a line of credits. There's a whole lot of requirements to a provider participating in the BEAD program as applying for the program and then ultimately being awarded a project that vary very much differently than the VADI program, where we partner with a unit of local government. We have a minimum of a 20% match requirement, which requires 10% from the ISP. And so for the BEAD program, a lot of the onus is on the private sector, unlike the VADI program, where there's a more joint public-private partnership. As Chandler stated earlier, it is our goal in the scoring to incentivize public-private partnerships in BEAD in the scoring for us. However, that appears, based on what we've read in the NOFO, not to be the intent of the actual BEAD program. There is a component around local coordination, and so we're going to work through that, which is why we're having this input session, and we will be talking about that in more detail when we issue volume 2. And I hope that answers your question in terms of the match.
Thanks for catching that, Tamara. I think I'm trying to go in order of when things came into the chat versus when we've had hand raised online. I think Jason's question in the chat is the next one in that order. The first question there from Jason, and we'll go one, and then 2 here. There's only a way to challenge whether CAIs should or shouldn't be included. Is there then a distinction in the CAI list between eligible CAIs or ineligible CAIs? Jason, my understanding of the federal guidance here on this front is that our definition, if a CAI can justify their inclusion under that definition, then they are then in fact an eligible community anchor institution. That we would then vet to include them into that list of eligible CAIs. I don't believe that we have a role as a state broadband office to say a CAI is ineligible unless we do it in the challenge process and say you guys don't fall under this definition and therefore we're not going to include you. The second question, is there a rebuttal process for claims by an ISP that an area will be served by June 30th, 2024? The answer is yes, and I would encourage you to go read the specific rebuttal requirements in volume 1 of the initial proposal, but there is a way to submit a rebuttal to that as a locality or a nonprofit to a claim by an ISP on that front. So now I'm going to go to Karen online. Karen, if you want to unmute yourself, go ahead and ask a question.
Hi, yes, good afternoon. Thank you. So I have 2 questions actually. So the first question about, stakeholders and stakeholders engagement. So will there be additional opportunities for stakeholders input? And I guess these are all virtual sessions that you've been hosting across the state?
So for the BEAD program, Karen, we've been engaging folks and the folks that we work with, plus adding in nonprofits and community anchors into the 5-year plan and initial proposal. We've had listening sessions for that. This is the first of 2 input sessions that we'll have. Well, this one is for volume 1. The second one we'll have, and maybe additional for volume 2. We're also doing a lot of stakeholder engagement on the front of the Digital Equity Act and Virginia's Digital Opportunity Plan. I don't want to get too far into that because that's not the purpose of this call, but we are working with community action agencies. We're working with a consultant to do local and in-person meetings to make sure that we're understanding the full suite of needs under the digital divide, access, affordability, and adoption. So there's this specific effort, which is deployment for now. It will eventually, as long as the funding is available, shift into affordability and adoption. But we are focusing specifically on the digital opportunity needs under that separate federal authorizing area.
Okay, and the second question, did I hear you to say that localities such as, I'm here on the Eastern Shore, if we've received a body grant, that we would not be considered with part of the allocation under BEAD?
Yeah, I appreciate you asking that. And I didn't mean for that to come across like the entire locality is ineligible if you received a VADI grant. So we make VADI grants based on individual locations, right? When we get an award area set, we can go down to the individual location specific level and say, you've got funding or you're not included in the VADI project. So when we publish that list of unserved and underserved locations, that's also at the location level. And if your locality has homes, businesses, community anchor institutions that fall out of a VADI project or a federally awarded area, then they'll be on that list of unserved and underserved and still eligible for funding in that area.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to go next to the chat, Marcy Morgan. Can you clarify the statement you just made? It sounded like it sounded as if you may structure your BEAD program to request applications just from fiber to the home providers. Once the outcome of that has been determined, then conduct a subsequent round for any remaining unserved and underserved locations that would allow for alternative technologies. So Marcy, this ties back into the federal guidance and even the congressional language that was established for the BEAD program. As you guys know, the VADI program in the Commonwealth has been technology neutral. The locality chooses what ISP to partner with and what technology type that ISP uses in the process, and then submits an application to us. The BEAD program is structured federally in a way that we must prioritize fiber to the home solutions for unserved locations. The way we do that functionally is by setting what's called an extremely high cost threshold. That will be done in volume 2 of the initial proposal, where the dollar amount, we set a dollar amount. If we don't receive a fiber to the home solution to serve that location under that dollar amount, then we put that location back out for inviting proposals to submit a non-fiber to the home solution to serve that location. This is not something that we have purposefully structured this way as a broadband office, but it's how we are interpreting and making active the federal guidance for the program. Tamara, go ahead.
I just wanted to weigh in, and so I want to remind folks while we're here to talk about BEAD, and I don't want to deviate from the BEAD conversation. We do have a additional funding through VADI through fiscal year 24, which actually starts, gosh, in a couple of weeks. And so we will be reaching back out to all of you to be a part of that stakeholder process as well, as we have done for the last 5 rounds of VADI, where we develop program guidelines. And so remember, we are fortunate, unlike most other states, where we still have a state general fund that does support broadband expansion. And so while we are completely tied to the rules for the BEAD program, remember, we do have some flexibility in the project type. We're still technology agnostic fully from the body funding that we receive from the General Assembly. So I'm not going to go off and talk about that, but we will be reaching out and doing our normal stakeholder process for the next round of body. So I do want to just share that.
It's a great point. The next question is, I'm going to go Terry in the chat, and then Spencer, you're on deck. Terry's question in the chat is, since NTIA hasn't published a final challenge process, how is DHCD going to handle commenting on the final process? So Terry, it's a great question. It's something that we had to consider when we're trying to maintain our accelerated schedule under the BEAD program. And we will consider comments on this draft challenge process, our draft challenge process, which is the federal draft challenge process, in light of the final in light of their final draft for states when it is published. The reason we think we can do that is that we don't anticipate there being huge, substantial edits to the federal challenge process. Based on the comments that were submitted in that, we think there'll be tweaks around the edges. I mean, they may be tweaked to what an eligible rebuttal criteria is for a specific challenge under a specific category. And in that way, we can incorporate comments we receive on the draft in light of whatever that final determination is by NTIA.
And I'll weigh in, just so you all know, we've already consulted with NTIA regarding our draft of our initial proposal. And so this was the reason, if you all remember, who participated in our earlier input sessions, we actually issued a full initial proposal, and then we got advice from NTIA to change our initial proposal to volume 1 and volume 2. And not that I'm giving any other states credit, but Louisiana and Hawaii have both already issued their volume 1. And so this was technical assistance provided directly from TA through the staff at NTIA. And so I feel confident that they've given us great technical assistance and advised us on the best course of action to move forward.
So good question from Gary in the chat. We're coming to that one after we hear from Spencer. So Spencer, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you, Chandler. I was looking at the federal mapping, been looking a lot at that. And I'm trying to figure out if the states, if the broadband office is going to mirror that mapping. I know it's all consolidated, but in looking at a lot of the areas that are shown in my county, Rockbridge, that are shown as 100% covered, a lot of those are by satellite only. And since there's a focus on getting fiber to the home, I was just wondering if that is a legitimate challenge, if it states it's 100% covered, but it's only by satellite.
It's a really good question. I'm glad you asked, so we can clarify. The BEAD program only sets out specific technology types that are considered to be reliable broadband service. Those technology types do not include unlicensed fixed wireless, and they don't include satellite. That's geosynchronous satellite and non-geosynchronous satellite. So we don't have to worry about those coverage claims under the BEAD program. We don't consider those coverage claims under the BEAD program. So you guys are, the specific technology types that are considered by BEAD and would disqualify a location from funding eligibility if it meets 100/20 service is cable, fiber, licensed fixed wireless, and DSL.
Thank you. Can I ask a follow-up?
Go ahead. Yeah.
So I guess how are we to know that? I mean, I'm using the federal maps as a guideline. Is there going to be something that we can react to from the state level?
Yep, there will be. So when we publish our final guidance for initial proposal volume 1, we will publish in tandem a list of unserved and underserved locations. You guys, and if you have a GIS department, you should pull that up. If you don't, come to us. We'll help you interpret it. But that will be the list of locations to react to and compare against where you guys think are unserved and underserved locations.
Thank you, Chandler.
Yep. So we'll go to the Gary's question in the chat now. Do you have further guidance on speed tests to show service is not available? Speed test at peak times might be below the underserved threshold, but at other times speed might be adequate. Also, internal Wi-Fi issues in a location could result in a slower speed test results. Are there any specific requirements for time of test or whether the testing device needs to have a good connection to the router? Really good question again, and I feel like I'm saying that about all these questions. And I'm generally speaking here, and I can send you the specific location, and I can send anybody the specific language after this call. I don't have it on memory. Generally speaking, speed tests are not a valid challenge or rebuttal criteria. There are parameters around that, and there is a window for speed tests to be considered as a challenge or rebuttal criteria. But generally speaking, speed tests are not valid in the challenge process. That's by the federal guidance, for clarification. Follow up from Jason in the chat. Unless they show latency of greater than 100 milliseconds. Yes, if you guys can, well, I'm not technologically literate enough to tell you whether or not latency at the device is influenced by latency received at the router. So I'd have to get back to you on that. Questions from folks on the phone? Anybody calling in that has any questions? Last call for anybody in the chat, or if anybody's online joining by computer, please unmute yourself. This is the last call. Excellent. Well, we appreciate everybody's time. We know it's going to take all hands on deck to get the BEAD program right, but it's a huge opportunity to get to universal broadband in the Commonwealth. I mean, so we look forward to working with you guys on this. Please let us know if you have any questions moving forward. The public comment deadline is June 21st by 11:59 p.m. So please get the comments in, any discussion you have on volume 1 of the initial proposal by that time. If you want to have a conversation beforehand or afterwards, also drop us a line at that email address on the screen. I'm going to answer the one question left in the chat and then close us out. From Gary, is there any way to address reliability of service in terms of consistent speed? I'm going to have to go back and read the federal guidance on that to give you an accurate answer. But with speed tests generally not being considered under BEAD for an eligible challenge, I'm not sure there's a way to address reliability of service other than what is specifically mentioned in those criteria in volume 1. So if you want to add that as an eligible criteria, please submit a public comment by June 21st, 11:59 p.m. So with that, thanks everybody for joining. Tamara, I'll turn it over to you if you have any closing remarks or closing comments, and then we'll go forth.
Sure. I just want to thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I know it's a lot of information. Please stay in touch with our team. As we hear more information from NTIA, we will be sharing with you all. If you're not part of our stakeholder email list, make sure you contact our office. Our email address is on this last slide that Chandler and Cole have displayed. And again, thank you all. If anyone was around when Courtney Dozier was the chief deputy broadband advisor, she used to say, we're building this plane as we're flying it. And I feel that definitely that way with the BEAD program. And so thank you all for your continued patience, and thank you for being a part of our work in solving the digital divide in Virginia. And we look forward to continuing the great work of VADI and also having an opportunity to look at affordability and adoption with the opportunities through BEAD. And so stay in touch, and please go look at volume 1 and give us comments on what you all think you'd like for us to add or remove from the document. And we look forward to hearing from you soon. And remember, June 30th, its date, we'll find out what the Commonwealth will receive for the BEAD program. With that, I'll go ahead and close it for the afternoon. Bye.